Hi class, welcome to our first video on gender and behavior. In this module, you'll be learning about gender stereotypes and their consequences, gender similarities and differences, some of the explanations for gender differences, and sexism and sexual harassment in the workplace. In this first video of 4, you'll be learning about gender stereotypes. It's important to note that like any module in this course, what you're learning is based on research. It's also important to point out that while you've been learning about what research supports throughout this course, research is continuously growing and evolving. So you might find some information in this chapter or in others that you may find doesn't align with your own experiences. Keep in mind that your experiences may be very unique and not necessarily representative of what all people tend to experience. Also, as I mentioned, keep in mind that research is continuously evolving and growing. And so what we see is true today we may find is not so true many years from now. However, as we think about major theories that have been around for a long time, we tend to find that those continue to be supported. However, there are always opportunities for further exploration, and there's always the potential for new ways of looking at things. I would encourage each of you to look at the back of your textbook in the reference section and identify a couple of journal articles or other sources that you think are interesting and to just do a search for those articles online. Perhaps you could do this at the end of the semester or maybe once the semester is completely over. I just suggest this because you will find that by doing so, you're going to be able to strengthen your understanding of research methodology and you'll be able to strengthen your critical thinking skills. As you do this, you'll also have the opportunity to consider the potential strengths and weaknesses of studies as well. For myself, when I'm reading any interesting book or any interesting article, I will always look in the references section to identify opportunities for further learning. That's where I tend to find the most interesting sources that I may have not been able to find or even known about otherwise. So I find that this is a great way to deepen knowledge about topics that I'm interested in. What I'd also encourage you to do is to be sure to take a look at the supplemental videos that are within this module. The first one I have provided here as a heading. You'll see it's called Gender Roles and Children Video Clip. So I'd encourage you to take a look at this. I think you'll find it interesting, and as you watch this video clip, I'd encourage you to think about your own experiences when you were a child in learning about what it means to be the gender that you are. So how did you come to know what gender you are? How did you come to know what it means to be that gender? When did you think you perhaps came up with, or when did you identify that you were that gender? When you were a child, did you identify that? And I think you'll find that there are many opportunities like this for reflection throughout this particular module. This is a really interesting topic. I hope you find it as interesting as I do. So let's get started. So, what do you think? Is this a myth or is it a reality? Gender stereotypes in the US have dramatically changed in recent decades. Do you think that this is definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you selected mostly true, you're right. So gender stereotypes have changed, but there are still many stereotypes out there. I'd encourage you to go on YouTube and just do a search for commercials from the 1960s, 70s, or of course the 50s. And I think you'll clearly see very blatant gender stereotypes about both men and women. The stereotypes that we tend to see portrayed today may not be as blatant, but they're still present and they still affect how we tend to see ourselves. And for some of us, we may be more affected by what we see. And for others, we may see gender stereotypes or be presented with media that portrays gender stereotypes more often, depending upon the channels that we watch on television, the movies that we watch, how frequently we interact with media, and the people that we tend to spend time with. How about this one? Men and women tend to be more similar than different on most psychological variables. What do you think? Is this definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? We always hear about how different men and women are. At least I tend to recall hearing this often before coronavirus when I had many more conversations with people. But let's see, what does the research support? Well, it actually supports that women do tend to be more similar. This is mostly true. We're going to be learning about gender similarities and differences in this particular module. I think you'll find what you learn to be very interesting. And as you learn about these similarities and differences, I'd encourage you to begin thinking about the sources of these similarities and differences. We'll be exploring them later in this module, but I'd encourage you to begin thinking about where these similarities and differences originate. How about this one? Children learn gender roles through early play activities. Do you think this is definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you selected definitely true, you're right. Think about your early play experiences. Now, you may not be able to remember some of them because when we think about early play, we can think about being 2 and 3 and 4 years of age. And many of us may not have much recollection of being that young. But when researchers look at the play activities of children at that age, they tend to see some gender stereotyped behaviors. And you'll find how, as you learn about gender roles and gender stereotypes, I think you'll find yourself thinking about how it is important for us to make sure that children are provided with lots of opportunities that are varied when it involves play, because we want children to build lots of different skills and to build confidence in lots of different areas. All right, let's look at one more. Only women experience problems related to gender roles. I think we do tend to hear a lot of emphasis placed on women and their experiences, and certainly a lot of this conversation is pretty legitimate. When we think about the history of women and women's rights, we know that it was only until the last century that women had the right to vote. We know that women had to really fight for this right. We know that even in the 1970s, early 70s, I think, women could not get a credit card without the permission of her husband, and they had legislation that then was enacted that allowed women to have their own credit cards. I mean, these are just a couple of things that were just in the past century. So we learn about these things in perhaps our history classes. We may hear about them just in general as we're watching television or as we're reading, and we know that they're real. But we also need to keep in mind that men also experience problems related to gender roles. Men experience a lot of pressure on them that is because of the gender roles that they think that they often think they need to fulfill. And so we're going to be exploring this, and we're going to be exploring the effects of this pressure that men may experience. And I'm sure many of you know, or you can imagine what the effect is. So I think it's so important as we think about gender that we need to think about this from the perspective of both men and women having their own experiences, and that their experiences are can be equally negative, and they can also be equally positive, just depending upon their environment and depending upon the support or lack of support that they may have. So what is the answer to this? Well, it's definitely false. So we know that men experience problems related to gender roles. What are you going to be learning about in this video? You're going to be learning about the nature of gender stereotypes and their connection to concepts known as instrumentality and expressiveness. And you're also going to be learning about some important points about gender stereotypes. So I'd encourage you to take a moment to reflect. What role do you think the media plays in how males and females view themselves? And I know that the media is a very big term. We're not just talking about television or film, we're also talking about things like social media or news articles or videos that we might come across on YouTube or any type of media that we are exposed to. And how do you think the media affects how males and females view themselves? As I think about this, I think about the importance, because I have young children, of supervising my kids and making sure or being aware of what they're seeing on YouTube. My kids like to get on YouTube. I do have a filter. I have kids YouTube. My kids like to get on there because they like to watch other kids playing video games. I don't like them doing this a lot, but they are really interested in doing this. But I've noticed that even then, that there are some pretty specific portrayals in some of the videos that I've seen of how males and females are portrayed. I know, for example, on one YouTube channel, there's a guy that he plays Minecraft, and so does his wife. And as I've watched their interactions, I can see those some of those gender stereotypes, the ones that maybe we don't want our kids to develop or be exposed to. And I say this because there are some negative consequences related to gender stereotypes. I'm certainly not saying this because I do or don't disagree with traditional roles related to gender. That's not that's not something that is really even relevant, what I think about that. But I do think it's important for us to be thinking about these things, for us to think about how do these videos, even subtle messages, how do they affect how children's views about what it means to be male or female, or even this idea of dichotomy of male versus female, when there's a lot of research supporting the idea that masculinity and femininity are not absolutes, that there's a lot that can be in between. So let's go back to this question here. How are women portrayed and how are men portrayed? What are if you think about the most recent television show you've watched, how have the women been portrayed and how have the men been portrayed? And what messages do you think the media sends about how women should look and behave? And what about men? I know for myself, and it may be the types of television programs I watch, and I don't get to watch much television, but when I do notice that generally it seems that the women tend to be very attractive. They tend to be very focused, and there's a lot of emphasis on their physical appearance. Not that the women necessarily are, but whoever is making that television program or that film, they tend to put a lot of emphasis on how that woman looks. And it seems that most of the women who are in television programs or in television shows that have been very successful, they tend to be very pretty women, very attractive. Whereas I've noticed that in my own experience, I don't think that that's the case as often for men. Again, that's my own experience. You may have had very different experiences, and we know that we each live our own unique lives. But I think this is a testament to how different our experiences can be, if yours have been different than mine, and then how these experiences can then, of course, shape our views of ourselves. So if I'm frequently seeing really pretty women on television, I'm learning then, especially if I'm a young girl, I'm learning that women are supposed to look very pretty and that this is the standard. This is what you're supposed to look like when you are a woman. And that and this is how men are supposed to behave, and this is how men are supposed to look. So these are pretty powerful messages. Some additional important concepts that are presented in your textbook are found here. We have gender identity, which is an individual's perception of himself or herself as a male or female. We've talked about gender stereotypes, and these are those widely held and often inaccurate beliefs about males and females' abilities, their personality traits, and social behaviors. What do you think are some stereotypes about women and their ability to parent versus men? What about nurturing? Who tends to be thought of as more nurturing? Who often is given custody of children during a divorce? Is it more often women than it is men? Do you think that any of this has to do with gender stereotypes? Or do you think that there are other explanations? Or are there multiple explanations? Of course, there are going to be multiple explanations besides just gender, but I wonder to what degree gender stereotypes may play a role in the decisions that judges make. I wonder about the age of the judge. I wonder, do older judges tend to award custody more frequently to women than they do men, or is there no difference? Those are interesting things to think about. Gender differences, this is what we're going to be exploring here in just a moment, and these are actual disparities in behavior between males and females based on research observations, very different than gender stereotypes. Another important term is gender roles. These are culturally defined expectations about appropriate behavior for males and females. What are some ideas that you have about what is quote unquote appropriate behavior for males or appropriate behavior for females? I know when I was growing up, my grandmother thought that men should open the door for women. And I remember walking down the street with my grandmother and she said, never date a man who makes you stand on the side of the sidewalk that's closer to the cars. That the man should always be on that part of the sidewalk. Now, my grandmother, she has since passed away, but she was in her 90s. She would be in her 90s today. And so, she grew up during a time that women were viewed very differently than they are today. And when she was growing up, the reason that men were thought to need to walk on the side of the road that was, or the side of the sidewalk that was closer to cars, was to protect women from having water or mud splashed on them. So I remember those messages from her, and I don't know that I internalized those messages, but I remember thinking about those as I was growing up. And I wonder, how affected are we by what we hear from our grandparents or from our parents about what males and females should be doing? And then we have gender role identity, and this is a person's identification with the traits regarded as masculine or feminine. It's one sense of being masculine or feminine. And then we have sexual orientation. And this is different from gender identity. This is a person's preference for sexual partners of the other gender, or the same gender, or both genders. Here are some examples of gender stereotypes, and these were stereotypes that were recently reported by college students, and that they thought of typical masculine stereotypes as being involving athleticism, competitiveness, being a financial provider, good at problem solving, independent, physically strong, self-confident, standing up to pressure, and taking a stand. And that feminine stereotypes were involving creativity, being emotional, being gentle and graceful and kind, tending to the house, and being understanding. So how do you feel about these stereotypes? How does this affect how you see yourself as a male or a female? How do you think gender stereotypes affect people who don't fall within the confines of these stereotypes? I would venture to say that many of you may not fall within the confines of these stereotypes. Do you ever feel pressured to act a certain way around certain people because of gender stereotypes? Or do you intentionally take a stand and say, I'm going to be myself? How important do you think it is for us to have a sense of self-confidence and a sense of support growing up so that we feel comfortable in showing who we really are in terms of our gender? How important do you think it is for children to have options and to not feel pressured to fulfill specific stereotypes? How does this then relate to one's mental health? Overall, I think it's important to note that there is a lot of variability within gender stereotypes, and this interacts with race and socioeconomic status. So we see these overall stereotypes, but then we're going to see more specific stereotypes that are tied to one's race, and then we're also going to see more specific stereotypes that are tied to socioeconomic status. So we may see different stereotypes among those who are of high socioeconomic status versus middle versus low. And when we think about race, think about the different races and their cultural history and how then this may play out in terms of gender stereotypes. Overall, the boundaries between male and female stereotypes have become less rigid since the 1980s. Who do you think feels more pressured to fulfill these stereotypes or to align their behavior with stereotypes? Do you think it's people with certain psychological characteristics? Do you think it's people of certain upbringings or from certain regions or cultural backgrounds? Do you think that one gender feels more pressure than the other? Or do you think that there's not much difference among anyone, that everyone feels a lot of pressure? Or do you think that few people feel pressure? And then I think it's also important to note that the traditional male stereotype is seen as more complementary. And this is called androcentrism, or the belief that the male is the norm. So here's an example from a cartoon. You can see here on the left-hand side, we have the thinker. But then we might also see this person on the right-hand side who's a female as the worrier. And these two women say, I guess it just depends on who's doing it. When we think about androcentrism, we're talking about a behavior, and we're thinking about the behavior as being viewed differently if it's coming from a male than if it's coming from a female. So here are some examples. So a man in the workplace may be seen as being very detail-oriented, whereas a woman who is in the workplace and is also detail-oriented may be viewed as picky. A male in the workplace who is assertive, he is, he says what he thinks, he stands up for what he thinks is important. He's seen as assertive, which we think of as typically favorable, but for her, she may be seen as pushy. For a man who has multiple partners, dates a lot of women, he's a man of the world, and there's lots of different phrases or terms we might use to describe that man. And typically, those traits are much more often going to be seen as positive traits or expressed positively than they would be for women, where this example states she's been around. Think about a man who exercises authority. He's going to be seen as more controlling, she's going to be seen as more controlling. I was thinking, just as for a moment, as I was looking at these, I was thinking about the behaviors of people who are currently in office. And I wonder, about like our president or vice president. And I wonder if they were females, if Donald Trump was a female, or if Mike Pence was a female, I wonder how their behaviors would be viewed. I wonder, would their behaviors be viewed differently? And I wonder, would they be viewed more negatively, more positively? This idea of androcentrism would suggest that they would be viewed more negatively. I wonder what you think. I wonder about future leaders, whether they be Democrat or Republican. And if they are males, I wonder, are we going to see their behavior more positively than we might females, even if the behavior is the same? Do you think that this will change over time? Do you think that younger generations have different views about behaviors and identifying masculine behaviors? Are they less likely to view masculine behaviors or behaviors that are exhibited by men more favorably than when those same behaviors are exhibited by women? Do you think older genders or older generations are more susceptible to this idea of androcentrism? I wonder what we can do as parents to help our children to recognize that when a person is detail-oriented, they are just detail-oriented, that we don't need to be thinking about that behavior as different if it's coming from a male or if it's coming from a female. I think these are interesting things for us to think about, some interesting issues related to gender. So let's just take a few moments to test yourself. Suppose you're explaining the participants section of a research article to a first-year student, so to someone who is just now starting college, and you explain that researchers use blank when referring to male-female differences that are learned and blank to designate biological differences. So which of these terms here, is it gender or sex, is used to refer to male and female differences that are learned, and which is used to designate biological differences? Are the terms used interchangeably or are they different? And which are they? Well, if you selected gender as referring to male-female differences that are learned, and sex as the term for the designation of biological differences, you're right. So be sure to know the differences between the two because they're very distinctly different. Here's another one. The androcentric bias in gender stereotypes refers to what? Is it the finding that a greater number of traits are attributed to men than to women? The finding that a greater number of traits are attributed to women than men? The belief that traits associated with males represent the norm? Or the belief that traits associated with females represent the norm? If you're not sure what the answer is, if you don't remember what androcentrism is or androcentric bias is, go back and take a look at your textbook, or you can just rewind this video a little bit and you'll be able to find the answer. If you selected the belief that traits associated with males represents the norm, you're right. So if you go back in this video, you'll see that I have some examples of how androcentrism might play out in the workplace and how women who may have some traits that are more typically, stereotypically masculine may be associated with those traits in some negative ways. And fortunately, we are seeing this decline somewhat, but we're still seeing this. If we look at the research, researchers are still seeing this androcentric bias. You can also find the same chart in your textbook with those examples. So, what have you learned? Well, you learned about gender-related concepts, and you also learned about the nature of gender stereotypes and their relationship to both instrumentality and expressiveness. You also learned about some important points about gender stereotypes, and you learned about androcentrism. So what will you be learning about next? Next, you're going to be learning about how meta-analyses are helpful in understanding gender. You're going to learn what a meta-analysis is. Some of you may know what that is, but if you don't, you'll be learning about that in our next video. You'll also be learning about something called the gender similarities hypothesis. And you're going to be learning about research on gender similarities and differences in verbal, mathematical, and spatial abilities, as well as in personality, social behavior, and psychological disorders. And then we're going to be exploring some of the explanations for why gender differences appear larger than they actually are. And then what we're going to be doing, and finally in our video, is we're going to be looking at why these gender differences are present. So what are some of the major explanations for these differences? Are they environmental? Are the explanations or are the reasons biological? And if they're environmental, what role does classical conditioning play, operant conditioning? What role does observational learning play? If they're biological, what role do hormones play? We often think about hormones when we think about gender differences. So that's going to be interesting. And then what about brain differences? So you'll be learning a lot of really interesting information in our next video. So as always, if you have any questions about anything you're reading or anything that you've learned about in this video, please do not hesitate to reach out to me.